Welcome, Julia.
Hi.
Good to see you.
Good
I'll
to
give
see
you
you
a
as
quick
well.
introduction. We are very privileged today to have Professor Julia Meszaros presenting to us. Professor Meszaros became a professor 10 years ago and has spent the last 5 years at Texas A&M and currently teaches research methods, sociology, and anthropology. But she has a particular specialty, which is of particular interest to us. There is no more studied person that we know of in the niche of premium international dating. Julia's gone to great lengths to travel out and to study and take the academic perspective on this most misunderstood segment of the dating industry. So please bring us some understanding, bring us some of your insight and foresight, and you have the floor. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Mark. I really appreciate the platform and I look forward to everyone's questions. I'm going to quick share a file. Okay, so I want to talk about the PID market and kind of the changes that I've been witnessing in the past decade or so, well actually 14 years that I've been following the industry. And so here we go. Okay. Sorry, getting used to it. So, I did an ethnography of the industry to complete my PhD through the years of 2011 to 2014. I followed 3 romance tours with the company A Foreign Affair. A Foreign Affair is loveme.com, and they are one of the oldest still in operation companies that provides actual romance tours. I followed romance tours in Colombia, Ukraine, and the Philippines, interviewing men, women, and the employees who worked for A Foreign Affair on the ground. I also have spent time following the industry. I interviewed another person who offered tours, Mark Davis from Dream Connections. And then I also interviewed a number of Ukrainian matchmakers who were all based in Ukraine at the time, and a foreigner who started a company called Match Guarantee. So I've dealt with a number of companies, mostly focused in Ukraine, but Dream Connections and A Foreign Affair were in other countries as well. So what I've seen is that there's a largely segmented market when it comes to the PID market. So tour providers tend to capture the market of more middle class and upper middle class men, and men who are often repeat clients, a lot of entrepreneurs, people who have more flexible schedules and obviously enough funding to go on tours and travel abroad. Then you have a smaller group of more well to do men or middle class men who hire individualized matchmakers. And these tend to be people who are interested in higher end, more personalized services and are willing to pay for that service rather than be left to their own devices within a tour setting. And then online, at least in the PID market, tends to be more working class men, then they are not likely to actually travel to the destination. According to AFA, about 90% of the men that they encounter from online stay in an online setting, and only about 10% actually go in person to meet women. So the tour demographics, who are these guys? The majority of them are white. Most of them are from the US or the Western world. About 83% of the men I met were white. Sorry, this is kind of small for me to see. Okay. 83% white. A lot of men, as I said, from other Western countries as well as the US. So Australia, Canada, and Western Europe. 83% of them guys were over 40 years old. Nearly 92% identified as politically conservative. A lot of men from Texas, 17% from Texas. Texas, Florida, and California were overrepresented in the population from the US. 36% of the men were divorced. And during my time following these romance tours, I saw about 10 marriages, mostly with women from the Philippines, even though I did see one engagement in Ukraine and two in Colombia. This information is from a colleague of mine who studies this industry within China. And if she talks a lot about how a lot of the men who are interested in dating women in China online who don't really do tours often are working class guys. So random sample of 1,000 men from the dating site's web base or database. 29% of men self-reported salary of about 15 grand to 34 grand. 21% of men were earning between 35 and 50 grand, 49 grand. And then about 7% of men earn more than $150,000 a year. And if you're interested in learning more about the Chinese market, you can reach out to Dr. Monica Liu and you can ask me for her information. When she looked at the male clients interested in China, once again, USA is really dominant in the industry, but you also see large segments from the UK, Canada, Australia, right? Other Western countries, and within Asia, Singapore also as a wealthier Asian country. I also received demographics from a company called Rapid Visa. They provide low cost filing services to people who are interested in filing K-1 visas. So this is an online filing company. This is a bit skewed towards lower class men as well because it's a much cheaper service than hiring an immigration lawyer. So this is once again representing a lower segment of the PID market, mostly people who met online. So as you can see, most sponsors' income was less than 115K by a lot. The majority of people were making between 15 to 55K. And the most common professions of men tended to be truck drivers. A lot of them were retirees, sales representatives, quite a few unemployed, and some nurses and electricians. So following along, thinking about who kind of are coming to these sites, I put in a number of really popular dating sites, and the monthly page views you kind of see for Anastasia Date are quite high compared to a lot of the other sites. It tends to be the leader of the industry, and their subsidiary sites, Ama Latina, etc., also have quite a few monthly visitors. And then, of course, A Foreign Affairs still has quite a few. And if we see most of the traffic sources are coming from direct searches and links for most of these websites, which gives an idea of kind of how people are finding this industry to begin with. And a lot of men that I spoke to kind of heard about international dating while they were looking online for online dating options. So the PID market is kind of connected to the larger, obviously, online dating market. Then, as I pointed out, mostly the men I met and the racial composition of most site visitors tend to be predominantly white men. I did notice that there were quite a few Latino men who were interested in going to places like Colombia and other places in Latin America like Costa Rica. On the other hand, within Asia, I saw a preponderance of guys from Australia. And in Ukraine, I saw more of a diversity of races in terms of men attending tours. There were men who were Black American, Latin American, and whites. If we look kind of at site visitors' income from these slides, and I'm so sorry, it's so hard for me to see these small things when I'm in presentation mode. Okay. So as you can see, once again, large salaries, not that common in this industry. They tend to be more middle and working class guys. And they tend to be older guys. Once again, site demographics show that they are older men as well. And in terms of education, most of the guys are at least college educated or had some college. I met quite a few entrepreneurs who had their own businesses. And as I said, they tended to have more flexibility in allowing for travel and taking time off to go actually visit and tour in these places. So, COVID-19, you all know, obviously changed the industry quite a bit, and this also impacted the PID industry. So, the revenue for online dating in the US during 2020 was 620 million. 2020 was Tinder's busiest year. And during the COVID era, right, a lot of online company dating apps and companies were trying different things, such as virtual speed dating, dating advice sessions, and virtual therapy sessions, in order to kind of capitalize on the fact that people weren't able to meet in person. So let's facilitate this through an online setting. And as you can see, the amount of matches and amount of conversations jumped significantly during 2020 on a bunch of different sites in a bunch of different countries. All right, so I feel like this is also reflected in the PID market. More and more online services are being offered, and more companies are moving away from offering in person tours. A lot of the companies have always stated that the tours were never really money makers to begin with. And so I see more a preponderance of virtual events, virtual coaching, and more towards matchmaking. In the 10 years that I've been following the industry, I saw more and more demand and production of these personalized boutique matchmaking services. People really wanted to feel like somebody was actually trying to kind of hold their hand a bit. A lot of the men I encountered during my time following the industry were unsure of themselves and wanted that coaching, how to dress, how to deal with cultural differences. And they often didn't necessarily find that and just attending a tour. So a lot of them really were willing to pay for those increasingly personalized services. Also, I see that video and live chat features are now a huge component of the PID dating market. And I think that they are definitely here to stay post COVID. Obviously, the war in Ukraine has changed a lot in the dating industry. A lot of companies that existed that I talked about have gone out of business completely because of the war in Ukraine. Obviously, the war in Ukraine has exacerbated the travel difficulties that existed during COVID. There are still people who are willing to travel out there, but they are not necessarily with a group or sponsored. And a lot of matchmakers that I know have left Ukraine, are living abroad, and are still trying to do online matchmaking services from places like Romania and Germany. So, Ukraine was the largest PID market for a really long time. This industry started largely in the Philippines and in Asia with catalogs in the 1970s. And with the advent of the internet and the fall of the Soviet Union kind of coinciding in the early 90s, Ukraine and Russia really became the central focus of the industry for the past, I would say, 30 years. The requirement of Americans to get a visa before traveling to Russia has really slowed down the Russian component of the industry. And now the war in Ukraine has slowed down the Ukrainian component of the industry, which up until that point was really the large money maker for a lot of different companies who even staged tours in other countries or had websites in other countries. So everybody has stopped providing tours, and most non-local matchmakers closed up shop. As I pointed out, Dream Connections went out of business. A couple other tour companies went out of business, and matchmakers went out of business. Many have moved abroad. And with the unsure political situation and how long this war will last, my prediction is that the industry is going to start shifting its focus back into Asia. The Philippines has been growing in popularity because of how affordable it is. It's really accessible in that way financially. The fact that a lot of people speak English makes it an easier travel destination for a lot of the neophyte travelers that I encountered during my time following tours. And I also predict that online services are still going to be the predominant version of this industry, but we will see an expansion of video chat features, virtual dating services, and kind of AI chatbots preponderance, in communication with people on websites. So thank you for listening, and I'm here to answer your questions. And I'm curious to see what you all think about kind of my thoughts on the PID industry. So I'm curious to hear everyone's questions. Thank you so much.
All right, good. Just getting myself back on stage. We've got quite a few. Right, let's see who's got the top vote here. We have got Peter Christopher, who is the CEO founder of Togetherlight Industries, togetherlight.com, and that operates Christian Filipina. To your point about Asia, would you consider competing against your most? That is actually for your prior interview. Sorry. Did you learn in your studies that some portion of the... I'm going to put my proper glasses on. So much for those yellows.
I know I didn't wear glasses and I was struggling. So
things have changed. Right. Did you learn everything? Boom, crystal clear. Did you learn in your studies that some portion of the so-called PID businesses are mostly legitimate versus a different portion are mostly illegal businesses based on fraud?
All of the businesses I encountered were legal, legitimate businesses. I did randomly encounter a agency in Thailand that I found off the internet that was run by a British man and his wife. And I went there unannounced and they were a little creeped out. But other than that, was probably the most unsure I was about the legitimacy of one of the agencies. I did not really follow up with that agency. They kind of were like, "What are you doing here, lady?" But once again, I showed up there unannounced. So, but in general, yeah, most of these businesses that I've encountered are all legitimate, especially the ones based in the US are definitely IMBRA compliant, which is International Marriage Broker Regulation Act compliant, which requires that they do some sort of basic background check on the men and provide some resources in women's languages about domestic violence, etc., resources to them if they are going to migrate. So.
Yeah, that's a interesting piece of legislation that affects the PID industry. IMBRA. It's very specific to PID, of course. Do you have any data on the amount of revenue per company compared to the number of people who actually meet and get married through those services? Revenue per marriage, basically.
Well, the thing is, so the company I mainly followed, A Foreign Affair, they do not keep track of marriages because they say a lot of people do not self-report, right? So maybe they may meet through the website and get married and never bother to tell the company. So they don't really have an accurate head count even of how many marriages they actually have produced. So it would be really hard for me to say that just because, I have no idea how many marriages and they don't even know how many, because these are, things that I've begged them to tell me. How many marriages have you actually been successful in coordinating? How many people are actually on the website, right? So there's some things I'm not privy to, unfortunately. Yes.
Totally understand. No worries. And so if you've got any more questions, please put them in the Q&A section. I've got one here from Eddie Ankret, Dating Agency Association. He asked, what is PID?
Okay,
so Genesis on that as well. Yeah,
that's a good question. So Mark came up with this term, PID, Premium International Dating, to kind of talk about what we used to call the mail order bride industry. And both Mark and I are in agreement that that's a really outdated and very dismissive and kind of slurry kind of. It really is. It feels very 1970s. So, Mark has come up with Premium International Dating, and I think that fits much better with what the industry really is. I think the term mail order bride gives this impression that, a guy can just go and pay someone and just take this woman home without her consent, right? It makes it feel very purchased and very human trafficking. And so I think the industry wants to move away from that kind of thinking and logic and impression. And so I think trying to rebrand as the premium international dating industry is kind of the right move. So,
Yeah. I think in the past when it was books, it felt perhaps like mail order, but now we're no longer into the books. Everything's online as of the last 25 years, the quarter century basically. And premium, and the words premium and international pay homage to the key differentiators of this particular niche. It's premium, it's actually rather expensive to get the job done.
yes,
It's
and
far
a lot of men have invested quite a bit of money.
yeah,
So, for example, I met a guy who's only in his early 30s, and he was very much committed to finding a woman in Ukraine. And he had gone on a romance tour. He had hired two different matchmakers, right? And he had spent already 30 grand
yeah.
when we had spoken, right? And for a young guy, that's quite a bit of money to invest and still not have success, right? He still was single when we were speaking. He still is single to this day. So, right, some men are really willing. That's the thing, is the long-term clients, right? So that's kind of the matchmaker end, right? That these guys are willing to pour a lot of money in for those personalized services.
And even on the platforms, they can rack up when they're doing translation. Also, one of the nice things about the Filipino market is everybody speaking the same language at least, so there isn't the need for the translation. So it becomes a little bit more cost effective in that respect.
Yes, and I mean, realistically, even if you only chat on the internet and you never do a tour, you have to, following Imbra, right? You have to meet in person. So you're at least going to have to buy a ticket out to this person's country at some point and pay for some sort of trip. And you have to pay the visa, K1 filing, right? So it is not a cheap endeavor to find someone from abroad in general.
Yeah. And the other aspect is the international, which has a particular feature from a business perspective, in that we don't, in the PID segment industry, you don't need to have critical mass. There's zero critical mass requirement, which
There
in some
is
ways
no.
makes it quite appealing.
Right. Yes, exactly. There is no critical mass, and it is very niche, and it is very open for these kind of specialized services, coaching. A lot of guys who use the PID market, I think, are less confident in their dating capabilities and see, using a matchmaker as a good investment, particularly when you are, dating cross culturally.
Looks like I've got a couple more questions coming. So Peter asks, would you be willing to push the top 10 international services to allow you to directly contact their members to find out from their members how many were successful?
That's interesting. So as I said, a couple companies have folded in the meanwhile.
Yeah.
So I think at this point, the only company I could maybe push would be a foreign affair. And that would require some coaxing, I think, to get access to their email list. So I've been trying, I've wanted to send out a survey to their email list because I'm genuinely curious about their like deep demographics, right? Not just what I found on tour, but who are the men coming to the site in
Yeah.
general,
Yeah.
right? Which I think are going to be a different set of demographics. So that is something I will continue to work on, pushing AFA to, let me maybe do an email and just find out, because if I can provide them something from the survey, some knowledge about their client base and their success rate that they could advertise, maybe they would be interested in something like that.
They'd
So
love to know how they fit in with the rest of the market. The the
I think
the the trick would be to be able to publish something that's generally deemed positive that would show the numbers off industry wide. But it's always very difficult to crack. Cracking the nut of getting private information from a private company on their inner workings and statistics is that's a tough nut to crack.
it
So,
is a tough nut to crack as an outsider, right? So yeah.
Radha asks a very interesting question. Radha Patel asks, "Is it only men who are PID clients, i.e., seeking brides?"
Informal agencies, yes. So there are informal romance tour markets for women. A lot of women travel to places like Jamaica or the Bahamas from the US. A lot of women in Europe travel to Africa in places. A lot of Japanese women travel to Indonesia. But these are non formalized circuits of romance tourism that are not necessarily capitalized off of by a private company providing services. So the women do exist, but there isn't a formal industry to serve them.
Do you think that's big enough an industry for companies that are familiar with online dating to help put up some guardrails? It sounds like that could be a little dicey if they're non-formal, a little dangerous.
Correct. Yes, informal, it's dicey, right? And so there could be, I think it would help women feel safer if there was some sort of vetting process in, these informal markets,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
hmm
I feel like there's a whole nother conversation to be had there.
Yeah, no, I think it's super fascinating. There is also informal circuits of gay men, right, doing
Right,
this kind
right,
of
yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
Yeah, right. So, particularly in places like Colombia and the Philippines. And so there are parallel markets going on, right, that
Yeah.
are informal. So,
But my general experience with the events versus online is the money's online. The
oh,
events are
definitely.
window dressing, basically. They show off the brand, they show off the sentiment, but they're not the way to make money. You wouldn't just have an events business. It's a good way to lose money, actually.
Right.
Yeah,
Yes. No. And even the matchmakers, I think, are focused on a smaller amount of better paying clients, right?
yeah,
So,
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Good stuff. We covered some great ground there. There's a couple more questions here. We're at the half an hour. Why don't we continue a little bit into networking? And then I think there's going to be an interesting conversation on a couple of tables. So,
you.
Professor Meszaros, we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for paying us homage and giving us a great presentation. I'd love to take I'll take your presentation and I'll blow it up so we can do a larger. We can blow up some of these slides, by the way, if you like.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. It was so hard to read while I was presenting. So thank you so much, Mark, for inviting me. Thank you all for your questions. I really appreciate your interest in my research on the PID market. So
Always. Let's do this again as well. I appreciate it. Thank you very much,
yeah,
Julia.
thank
I'll see you
you.
in the networking. See you in the networking, everybody. Thank you.